Painting of Peace. Once upon a time, there was a king who had fought long and hard to bring peace to his kingdom. And finally, he had. His people were at peace, but he wasn't. Every night he would toss and turn with nightmares that would rack his dreams, and he would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, having heard the screams of the wounded and the dying, reliving every scene of the battle, and of course, the guilt. Oh, if only he had made this choice instead of that one, his men wouldn't have died. If only he had done this, if only he had known that. And of course, he was a king as well. And there were many things that he had done in anger that he regretted now. It is a very heavy burden to carry such power. And the king, looking out the window and seeing the people singing as they went about their work and seeing how everyone enjoyed life and he couldn't, his heart felt heavy. Would he never know peace? And finally he had an idea. Well, if he couldn't know peace deep inside his heart, perhaps if somebody could show him what peace was like, then maybe he could look at that before he went to sleep, and maybe he wouldn't have to be so tortured in his dreams. And so he hired the greatest artist in all the land, a man who was famous in that country and abroad for the most incredible, vivid paintings. And when the artist came, the king looked at him and said, "Can you paint peace so that I can know what it is?" The artist stared at the king long and hard, and he could see the tortured fear and guilt in the king's eyes. "Ah, yes," said the artist, "I can do that, but it'll take time." "You can have anything you need," said the king. "Take the best room in the palace, servants, the best paints, the best food, whatever." "That's all right," said the artist. "All I need is a simple room, no distractions, some paints, and a very, very, very big canvas." "Whatever you ask me, it shall be provided," said the king. And pretty soon, word spread that the greatest artist was making a painting of peace. People started talking about what it might be, because of course the artist was very secretive about his work, and not even servants were allowed in to see it. He would always keep the door locked whenever he left, which wasn't very often. Mostly he was inside this room painting every single day. The king himself was not allowed to see how the painting was coming, and he was very excited that perhaps finally, he would know what peace was like. And finally, a whole year after the artist had been given charge, the artist made the announcement that it was ready. Well, word spread throughout the kingdom, and thousands of people came to see the unveiling of the painting. By then, that was the only thing that people could talk about. What would it be like? What sort of colors would there be? How big was it? But nobody was more excited than the king himself. He hired the best orchestra to play the most amazing music, and when finally the painting was pushed out on wheels by several servants, some of the strongest servants, it was covered up by a big cloth. All the people held their breath, and as everyone watched, the artist stepped forward. "Your Majesty, behold, peace." And he pulled aside the blanket that covered the canvas, and everybody gasped. And then they burst into cheers and applause, and everybody started laughing and crying and hugging each other, because truly, it was so beautiful. The colors seemed to pop out of the canvas. It seemed alive. It seemed as if you could step right in it. It was a scene, a beautiful country scene with this big tree with little birds flying around it, and a babbling crystal clear brook running past the tree's roots, and there were flowers by the side of it, and horses were drinking from the stream, and the sun was shining, and There was a sheen as if it had recently rained, and there was a rainbow that you could just see in the distance. Oh, everyone looking at that felt, this was the kind of place where you could just sit and lose yourself and be at one with the earth, and all your troubles could melt away. And as the king looked at that beautiful painting, his eyes filled with tears, and he hung his head. Yes, it was beautiful, so beautiful. And he knew with certainty that he would never know peace. He would never really be able to live something like that. The artist had been watching the king this whole time. "Your Majesty," he said. "Yes," said the king, looking up and shaking himself. "Fantastic. Even grander than I expected. You will be richly, handsomely rewarded. Thank you very much. It is spectacular." "Your Majesty," said the artist, "I'm not done yet." And as the king watched curiously, and all the crowd waited with bated breath, the artist dipped a paintbrush in a big bucket of gray paint that only then did people notice he had right next to the canvas. And this big brush pulled it up, dripping, and suddenly threw that gray paint, splattering it across the canvas. People gasped, but then he grabbed another brush of red paint, and then black paint, and everyone gasped, "No, no, what are you doing?" And in a matter of seconds, that beautiful painting was completely and utterly destroyed. Somehow, he was, after all, the greatest artist in the land, somehow with just a few strokes, he had managed to change that idyllic scene into one of absolute horror. There was now a raging storm. A shaft of jagged lightning had split the tree down the middle, and the tree was in flames, and little dead birds were falling smoking into the water. And now the crystal clear brook was muddy and churning and dragging along rocks and debris and branches and the bloated dead bodies of the horses that had been caught in the storm. And now the little waterfall with the rainbow had turned into this violent, roaring, muddy torrent, brown waters crashing down over the rocks, dragging everything in its wake. Everything was destroyed. And the king, staring at this, he took it personally, like a dagger to the heart, because it was as if the artist had seen deep into his very soul and painted what was inside his heart and inside his dreams and inside his memories and inside his tortured guilt right there in front of him, laying bare the king's desperation and pain. "How dare you!" cried the king, as people cried out in horror. "It was so beautiful, it was magnificent, nothing like that could ever happen again." "How dare you!" cried the king. It was as if the artist were telling him that he would never find peace, that he would always be in pain. And even though that's what the king himself believed, he didn't want somebody else telling him that, because it made it too real. "Guards!" said, "Arrest him! Off with his—" But just as he was about to give the order to execute the artist, the king stopped, because he did have one rule, and that was to never order to kill anybody in anger. "Take him to the dungeons," he said. "I will decide what to do with him in the morning. And now, be gone, all of you." And everyone raced away. They were, to be honest, quite afraid of the king's rage. And soon the king was left completely alone, standing in front of this great painting. And then, alone, with no one to see him, finally, the king broke. And that night, he wept. Bitter, broken sobs that came from a part inside of himself he had never dared to go. Finally, the sun rose, and by now the king had wept out all the tears that he'd had inside. he stood up. "Guards," he said quietly, "bring the artist back." The artist was dragged back before the king. And the king stood, staring at the artist. It was just the painting, the king, and the artist. And the artist looked the king straight in the eyes and didn't say a word. "I've decided," said the king. "You will be executed today." The artist just looked at the king in the eyes and smiled faintly. "I knew it," said the king. "I knew it! I knew it! You're not afraid, are you?" "No," said the artist simply. "I knew it. You're at peace, even though I'm telling you that you're going to die. So tell me, what was this? Why did you do this?" "Well, obviously, Your Majesty, because I was trying to send you a message." The king almost felt tears starting to come back up, and he was like, No. "Message," he said. "I thought so, but I don't see it." "That's because you have to look closely," said the artist. And the king looked back at that great painting that was between them, that terrible scene of destruction and death. "Look small," said the artist. And the king looked at the details of the little birds with their feathers aflame falling into the water, and the lightning and the waterfall. And then suddenly, he saw it. Behind that muddy, brown, raging waterfall, there was a little crevice in the rocks that was perfectly dry. And in that little crevice was a little nest. And in that nest was a mama bird sitting on her eggs, fast asleep. "Your Majesty," said the artist, "just like me, you have known war and you have known pain. You have known death. Just like me, you sometimes wake up in the night, crying out. Just like me, you know that the world is not that peaceful, beautiful, idyllic scene that I painted earlier. That doesn't exist. But Your Majesty, just like me, amidst the storm, you can find a corner." And the king nodded. Amidst the storm, a corner. That was a peace that he could understand.